Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today's mystery. Tonight, we're setting sail aboard a luxury Mediterranean liner with the incomparable Hercule Poirot in the Sapphire Scion of Sorrento. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, because whether you're listening from a cozy corner of London or somewhere far across the seas, you're about to discover that some treasures are far more dangerous than they appear. Chapter 1. The Treasure Hunter's Tale. The Sapphire of Sorrento. Chapter 1. The Treasure Hunter's Tale. The dining salon of the Stella Maris possessed that peculiar elegance which only the finest ocean liners could achieve. Crystal chandeliers, swaying gently with the Mediterranean's rhythm, pristine white linens adorned with gleaming silver, and the soft murmur of cultured conversation floating above the distant throb of engines. That as our ship pulled away from the twinkling lights of Naples that October evening in 1936, I reflected that Poirot had chosen his restorative cruise with characteristic precision. Mon ami Hastings, my friend, had declared earlier, adjusting his perfectly waxed moustache with satisfaction, the little grey cells they require the sea air, and the cuisine of the Stella Maris magnifique indeed. As we took our places at the captain's table that first evening, I could see that Poirot was already in his element. His egg-shaped head turned this way and that, those remarkable green eyes, taking in every detail of our fellow passengers, with the methodical precision of a naturalist cataloguing specimens. The captain himself, a distinguished Frenchman named Dubois, presided over our table with quiet authority. His weathered hands moved with practiced economy as he gestured toward the approaching courses, and his dark eyes held that peculiar alertness I had observed in men accustomed to responsibility for others' lives. Gentlemen, Captain Dubois said, inclining his head toward Poirot and myself, may I present our fellow passengers. Lady Cordelia Finch, recently returned from archaeological pursuits in Greece. Lady Finch acknowledged us with a regal nod. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with prematurely silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon, and fingers that bore the telltale ink stains of the dedicated scholar. Her evening dress, while impeccably cut, showed the subtle signs of careful economy that spoke of reduced circumstances, nobility born, but not maintained. Professor Alistair Jones of Oxford, the captain continued, indicating a thin, precise man whose wire-rimmed spectacles reflected the chandelier's glow. The professor specializes in Mediterranean history, I believe late Roman and Byzantine periods, primarily. Professor Jones replied in cultured tones, his voice carrying the measured cadence of the lecture hall. He touched his spectacles with a nervous gesture that seemed habitual, though I confess a broader interest in the region's less documented periods. The captain's introductions were interrupted by a theatrical clearing of the throat from the far end of our table. All eyes turned to observe a most remarkable specimen of American prosperity, a large, florid gentleman whose diamond shirt studs caught the light with every emphatic gesture. Silas K. Vans, the man announced, half rising from his chair with considerable ceremony, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and currently engaged in the most significant archaeological discovery of the modern age. Miss Evelyn Holloway, seated beside him, visibly winced at her employer's pronouncement. She was a quietly pretty woman, of perhaps 30, with soft brown hair and an air of perpetual anxiety that seemed to intensify whenever Mr. Vance spoke. Her evening dress was elegant but understated, and she clutched a small beaded reticule as though it contained her entire worldly security. Miss Vance, Poirot said with polite interest, "You speak of archaeology. How fascinating. You are, perhaps, excavating in this region." Vance's eyes gleamed with the fervor of the true enthusiast. "Better than that, my foreign friend. I am on the very verge, mind you, of uncovering the legendary Sapphire Scion of Sorrento." The effect of this announcement was immediate and varied. Lady Finch's fork paused halfway to her lips, her expression sharpening with unmistakable interest. Professor Jones made a small sound that might have been scholarly derision, while Miss Holloway's cheeks flushed pink with what appeared to be mortification. "The Sapphire Scion?" Lady Finch inquired, her voice carefully modulated. "How extraordinary. I was not aware that particular legend had any basis in historical fact." "Ah," Vance declared, warming to his theme. "That's precisely what makes this discovery so remarkable. For generations, scholars, begging your pardon, Professor, have dismissed it as mere folklore. A magnificent sapphire, supposedly hidden by the old Italian nobility during some long-forgotten crisis lost to time and treasure hunters' dreams. Professor Jones adjusted his spectacles with a quick, precise movement. The documentation for such claims is typically, shall we say, unreliable, he said mildly. Local legends often embellish quite ordinary events into romantic fantasies. Unreliable. Vance's voice rose indignantly. My dear professor, I have spent 3 years and a considerable fortune tracking down documents that would make your academic heart race. Maps, letters, even a cipher keyal pointing to a location near Sorrento that has never been properly searched. Captain Dubois had been observing this exchange with the detached interest of a man accustomed to shipboard dramatics. You carry these documents with you, Monsieur Vance? He inquired. Every precious piece, Vance replied, patting his breast pocket meaningfully, including items acquired just this afternoon in Naples from a dealer who didn't realize their significance. Why, I have here a carved wooden bird that may well be the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Holloway's reticule slipped from her nervous fingers, clattering to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, I noticed that her hands trembled slightly. When she straightened, her pale face had taken on an almost greenish tinge. Perhaps, Mr. Vance, she murmured, the other passengers would prefer to discuss their own travels. But Vance was not to be deterred. With a showman's instinct for his audience, he withdrew from his pocket a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Even Poirot leaned forward with interest as Vance carefully revealed a wooden bird, carved with intricate detail and darkened with age. Appears quite ordinary, doesn't it? Vance asked triumphantly. But according to my research, this particular type of carving was used by certain Italian families as let us say, as a guide to hidden treasures. The dining salon seemed to have grown quieter around our table, though perhaps that was merely my imagination. Lady Finch's blue eyes were fixed on the wooden bird with an intensity that struck me as peculiar. While Professor Jones had gone quite still, his food forgotten before him, Poirot's own reaction was characteristically measured, a slight tilting of his magnificent head, a barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone I had learned to associate with his growing interest in a puzzle. Most intriguing, Monsieur Vance, he said quietly. And you believe this artifact will lead you to your sapphire? I'm certain of it, Vance declared, carefully rewrapping the bird and returning it to his pocket. Tomorrow, when we reach calmer waters, I intend to spend the day correlating my maps with this final clue. By the time we dock in Alexandria, gentlemen, I expect to have pinpointed the exact location of the greatest treasure discovery since Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb. The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the gentle clink of crystal and the distant sound of the ship's orchestra beginning their evening performance. As the conversation gradually turned to safer topics, I noticed that Poirot continued to observe our dinner companions with that peculiar intensity that always preceded his involvement in matters far more complex than they initially appeared. How prophetic those observations would prove to be, I could not then imagine. Chapter 2. The Locked Room Discovery. Chapter 2. The Locked Room Discovery. I was awakened the following morning, not by the gentle Mediterranean sun filtering through my porthole, but by the most extraordinary commotion. In the corridor outside my cabin, sharp, urgent voices carried through the walls of the Stella Maris, punctuated by what sounded distinctly like a woman's distressed cries. Hastily donning my dressing gown, I emerged to find the passageway in a state of considerable agitation. Several passengers had gathered near the far end of the corridor, their faces bearing that peculiar mixture of curiosity and alarm that accompanies unexpected drama aboard ship. At the center of the group stood Miss Evelyn Holloway, her normally composed demeanor shattered entirely. "He won't answer," she was saying to a uniformed steward, her voice rising with each word. "I've been knocking for nearly 10 minutes, and the door is locked from the inside." The steward, a competent-looking young man whose morning efficiency had clearly been disrupted by this crisis, shook his head gravely. "Miss, if you're certain the gentleman is inside... Of course I'm certain." Miss Holloway's hands fluttered helplessly. "Mr. Vance always rises at 7 precisely. He ordered his breakfast for 7, and when I came to review his schedule, her voice broke slightly. The breakfast tray is still outside his door, untouched." I noticed Poirot's familiar figure emerging from his own cabin, impeccably dressed. Despite the early hour, his sharp green eyes took in the scene with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. and he moved through the gathered passengers with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to taking charge of unusual situations. "What is it, Poirot?" I addressed Miss Holloway gently. "You are perhaps concerned for your employer's health." Miss Holloway turned toward him with obvious relief. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, yes, I'm dreadfully worried. You see, Mr. Vance suffers from a weak heart. His physician in Philadelphia warned him about overexertion. Last night after dinner, he was so excited about his research, he stayed up quite late going through his papers." "The door is definitely locked from within?" Poirot inquired of the steward. "Yes, sir," the young man replied. "I've tried my master key, but the bolt is thrown from the inside. Captain Dubois has been summoned, and Dr. Reichenbach is on his way." As if conjured by this mention, Captain Dubois appeared at the end of the corridor, his morning uniform crisp and his expression stern with the weight of shipboard responsibility. Behind him followed a distinguished gentleman whom I recognized as the ship's physician, a German doctor with silver hair and the confident bearing of long medical experience. "What is the situation?" Captain Dubois demanded briskly. The steward quickly explained the circumstances while Dr. Reichenbach examined the locked door with professional thoroughness. The physician's weathered hands traced the doorframe and tested the handle with gentle persistence. "We shall have to force entry," Dr. Reichenbach announced after his examination. "If the gentleman is indeed suffering from a medical emergency." Captain Dubois nodded grimly and summoned two able seamen from the ship's crew. Within moments, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the corridor as they applied their shoulders to the resistant door. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward to reveal the interior of Mr. Vance's luxurious first-class cabin. The sight that greeted us was both shocking and puzzling in equal measure. Silas K. Vance lay sprawled beside his mahogany writing desk, his large frame twisted at an awkward angle that spoke eloquently of sudden collapse. His face bore the purple complexion that I had learned to associate with apoplexy, and his bulging eyes stared sightlessly at the cabin's ornate ceiling. But it was the condition of the cabin itself that struck me as most extraordinary. Papers lay scattered across every surface. Maps, photographs, handwritten notes, and typed documents created a veritable blizzard of research materials. Books had been pulled from their shelves and lay open at seemingly random pages. The drawers hung open like gaping mouths, their contents spilled across the Persian carpet. "Ah, mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, stepping carefully into the chaos. "The poor gentleman, he has been searching for something with great urgency." Dr. Reichenbach knelt beside the body with professional efficiency, his fingers seeking pulse points and examining the obvious symptoms. Miss Holloway remained in the doorway, her face pale as parchment, one hand pressed to her mouth in obvious distress. "Apoplexy," the doctor announced after several minutes of examination, "almost certainly brought on by overexertion and excitement. The gentleman's heart has simply given way under the strain." Captain Dubois surveyed the disordered cabin with the practical eye of a man accustomed to shipboard emergencies. Clearly he was engaged in intensive work when the attack occurred, he observed. "The room shows signs of frantic activity." I found myself nodding in agreement with this obvious assessment, but I noticed that Poirot had moved to examine something near the deceased man's outstretched hand. Crouching with characteristic precision, my friend studied a small object that lay just beyond Vance's fingertips. "The wooden bird," I said, recognizing the carved artifact from the previous evening's dinner conversation. "Precisement," Poirot replied softly. "Most curious, is it not, that this should be the final object to hold Monsieur Vance's attention?" Miss Holloway stepped forward tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was so excited about it," she said. "He kept saying it was the key to everything, the final piece of his puzzle." Dr. Reichenbach had completed his preliminary examination and was gathering his medical bag with the brisk movements of a man eager to conclude an unpleasant duty. "I shall need to complete a more thorough examination, naturally," he informed Captain Dubois, "but I see nothing to suggest anything other than natural death. The gentleman's excitement over his treasure hunting appears to have proved quite literally overwhelming." Captain Dubois nodded and began issuing orders for the proper handling of the deceased and the sealing of the cabin. As the various officials went about their duties, I noticed that Poirot continued his methodical examination of the scattered papers and overturned furniture. Something in his expression, a slight furrow of the brow, a barely perceptible tightening around his remarkable green eye, suggested that all was not as straightforward as it appeared. he moved through the chaos with the careful steps of a man reading a complex story, written in the language of displaced objects and scattered documents. When he finally rejoined me in the corridor, where Miss Holloway was providing Captain Dubois with details of her employer's recent behavior, Poirot's face bore that particular expression of thoughtful concentration that I had learned to associate with the early stages of his most challenging cases. The morning sun streaming through the corridor portholes illuminated a scene of apparent tragedy, the sudden death of an eccentric treasure hunter, overcome by excitement in the pursuit of his obsession. Yet something in Poirot's demeanor suggested that the true story of Silas K. Vance's final hours might prove considerably more complex than this simple narrative would suggest. Chapter 3. Interviews in the Mediterranean Sun. Chapter 3. Interview. In the Mediterranean sun, the Stella Maris had settled into her steady rhythm across the Mediterranean by the time Poirot and I established ourselves on the sun deck that afternoon. The morning's tragic discovery had cast a pall over the ship's atmosphere. Yet life aboard a luxury liner must continue, and passengers gradually emerged from their cabins to resume the pleasant routines of shipboard existence. Poirot had positioned himself with characteristic precision at a small table beneath a striped awning, where he could observe the comings and goings of our fellow passengers, while appearing to do nothing more than enjoy the autumn sunshine. His notebook lay before him, closed but ready, and his green eyes missed nothing of the subtle drama unfolding around us. Mon ami, he said quietly, it is most important that we understand the relationships between our fellow passengers and the late Monsieur Vance. Death aboard ship it creates a closed circle, nest CEP, and in such circumstances, every detail becomes significant. Lady Cordelia Finch was the first to join us, approaching our table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to making careful decisions. She had exchanged her evening attire for a practical tweed ensemble, and her silver hair was secured against the sea breeze by a silk scarf that spoke of understated elegance. Mr. Poirot, she said, settling gracefully into the chair he offered, I understand you have some experience with irregular circumstances. Captain Dubois suggested I might speak with you about poor Mr. Vance. Madame is most kind, Poirot replied with a slight bow of his head. You were perhaps acquainted with the gentleman before this voyage? Lady Finch shook her head decisively. No, indeed. I encountered him for the first time at dinner last evening, though I must confess, his mention of Sorrento caught my attention. Rather forcibly, Poirot's eyebrows rose with polite interest. You have some connection to that region. My family once held considerable property in the area, Lady Finch explained, her fingers unconsciously worrying the clasp of her handbag. The villa was quite famous in its day, built in the 18th century and maintained for generations. Unfortunately, the costs of upkeep in our modern era. She trailed off with the particular dignity of those who have learned to bear reduced circumstances gracefully. And this property, it was sold recently? Poirot inquired gently. 3 years ago, Lady Finch confirmed, to an Italian industrialist who wished to convert it to a hotel. A necessary decision, but not an easy one. When Mr. Vance spoke so confidently about hidden treasures in Sorrento, I confess I felt a rather foolish stab of hope that perhaps some family valuables might have been overlooked during the sale. Poirot nodded sympathetically, a natural reaction. Madame, but you had no knowledge of this Sapphire Scion before yesterday evening? None whatsoever, Lady Finch replied firmly. Family legends, Mr. Poirot, are notoriously unreliable. If such a treasure had existed, surely my ancestors would have discovered it during centuries of residence. After Lady Finch excused herself for luncheon, we were approached by Professor Alistair Jones, who emerged from the ship's library carrying a leather portfolio that suggested dedicated research in progress. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the Mediterranean light as he settled into the vacated chair with academic precision. Tragic business about Vance, Professor Jones observed, adjusting his spectacles with that nervous gesture I had noticed the previous evening, though hardly surprising, given his excitement and obvious poor health. You found Monsieur Vance's theories unconvincing? Poirot asked mildly. Professor Jones made a small sound of scholarly dismissal. Unconvincing is rather charitable. The man was chasing romantic fantasies based on highly questionable documentation. I've spent considerable time studying the historical records of that region, Mr. Poirot, and I can assure you that tales of hidden Medici treasures are largely the invention of guidebook writers seeking to attract tourists. Yet you seemed most knowledgeable about the area during dinner, I interjected. Surely not every aspect of Mr. Vance's research was without foundation. The professor's response came with the measured cadence of the lecture hall. The Mediterranean coast has been thoroughly documented by serious scholars for generations. While there were certainly wealthy families in the region during various historical periods, the notion that significant treasures remained hidden into the modern era is simply archaeological romanticism. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And yet, Monsieur le Professeur, you carry research materials of your own, perhaps your own interest in the region. Academic research, Professor Jones replied quickly, his hand moving protectively toward his portfolio. I'm preparing a paper on late Byzantine influences in Italian coastal architecture, quite different from treasure hunting. I assure you. Our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Miss Evelyn Holloway, who approached our table with obvious reluctance. Her morning had clearly been difficult, her eyes were redrimmed with weeping, and her usually precise appearance showed signs of distress. Mr. Poirot, she said hesitantly, Captain Dubois suggested I should speak with you about Mr. Vance's recent behavior. As his secretary, I was perhaps more aware than anyone of his preoccupations. Poirot's manner became infinitely gentle. Mademoiselle, you have my sincere condolences. It must have been a great shock to discover it was dreadful. Miss Holloway interrupted, her voice catching slightly. But I fear I wasn't entirely surprised. Mr. Vance had become increasingly agitated over the past week. He barely slept, barely ate. This quest of his had become an absolute obsession. He spoke to you of his research? Poirot inquired. Miss Holloway nodded warily. Constantly. Every new document, every theory, every wild connection he imagined between historical events and this supposed treasure. He was convinced that his discoveries in Naples yesterday represented the final breakthrough he needed. The wooden bird? I asked. Among other things, Miss Holloway confirmed. He purchased several items from various dealers' maps, manuscripts, that carving. He was absolutely beside himself with excitement, staying up until nearly dawn, cross-reef everything with his existing research. Professor Jones had listened to this exchange with obvious skepticism. Precisely the sort of amateur enthusiasm that leads to tragic outcomes. He commented. The man clearly overextended himself, chasing fantasies. As the afternoon progressed, Captain Dubois joined our gathering, bringing with him the professional competence of a man accustomed to managing both vessels and the complex human cargo they carried. His weather-beaten hands moved expressively as he described the ship's security procedures and the movements of passengers during the crucial evening hours. The night stewards report nothing unusual in the first-class section, Captain Dubois informed us. Mr. Vance's cabin showed a light until quite late past 2, according to the officer on watch, but this was not remarkable. Given Miss Holloway's description of his working habits and the morning discovery, Poirot asked. Entirely consistent with Miss Holloway's account, the captain replied. The breakfast steward confirms that Mr. Vance's tray remained untouched outside his door from 7:30 onward. The door was definitely locked from within. My steward's master key could not turn the bolt. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Mediterranean in shades of gold and azure, I reflected on the information we had gathered. Each passenger had provided reasonable explanations for their presence aboard ship and their reactions to Vance's dramatic announcements. Yet something in Poirot's demeanor suggested that these surface explanations might conceal more complex truths. The gentle rhythm of the ship's engines continued their steady pulse beneath our feet, carrying us inexorably toward Alexandria, while the mysteries surrounding Silas K. Vance's final hours seemed to deepen rather than clarify with each passing conversation. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The ship's library proved an ideal sanctuary for private conversation the following morning, its leather-bound volumes and mahogany paneling providing both comfort and discretion. Poirot had requested that Captain Dubois permit us to examine the effects removed from Mr. Vance's cabin, and these now lay carefully arranged upon the library's central table, like exhibits in some scholarly display. The wooden bird carving occupied the position of honor at the center of this collection, its dark surface gleaming under the reading lamps. Surrounding it were Vance's maps, his correspondence, several leather-bound notebooks filled with his enthusiastic scrawl, and the various antiquarian purchases he had made in Naples. Regard us, Hastings, Poirot said, lifting the carved bird with infinite care. This little fellow is not what he appears to be. N'est-ce pas? I examined the object more closely than I had the previous evening. It was indeed beautifully crafted, depicting what appeared to be a small songbird with wings folded close to its body. The wood had been polished to a rich patina, and intricate patterns decorated its surface. It appears to be a rather fine example of local craftsmanship, I observed, though I confess I know little about such things. Ah, but that is precisely the point, mon ami Poirot replied, turning the carving in his hands. This is not, as Monsieur Vance believed, a simple tourist souvenir. The wood itself noticed the grain, the particular way it has been carved. This suggests considerable age, and these markings he traced one finger along the bird's surface. They are not merely decorative. I think our examination was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Finch, who entered the library with the purposeful stride of someone seeking information rather than literary entertainment. She paused upon seeing us with Vance's effects spread before us, and I noticed a particular tension in her bearing. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I hoped I might have a word with you privately about our conversation yesterday. There are certain details I feel I should clarify." Poirot gestured toward one of the leather armchairs arranged near the library's windows. "But certainly, Madame, you have remembered something additional about your family's connection to Sorrento." Lady Finch settled herself with visible effort at maintaining her composure. "I fear I was not entirely forthcoming yesterday," she admitted. "When one's circumstances have been reduced, there is a natural tendency toward pride that sometimes obscures the truth. The truth, Madame, my family's financial difficulties were far more severe than I indicated," Lady Finch continued, her fingers working nervously at her gloves. "The sale of the Villa Finch was not simply a matter of convenience, it was absolutely necessary to prevent complete bankruptcy. My late husband's investments had failed catastrophically, and the property represented our final asset of any significance." Poirot's expression remained sympathetic but attentive. "This must have been most distressing." "More than distressing, it was devastating," Lady Finch replied with quiet intensity. "To lose the family seat, accumulated over generations, ... And when Mr. Vance spoke so confidently about hidden treasures in Sorrento, I confess I entertained the wild hope that perhaps something of value had indeed been overlooked, something that might restore at least a portion of what we had lost. And you had made no inquiries yourself regarding such possibilities." Lady Finch's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I noticed it nonetheless. "I may have made certain discreet inquiries," she admitted finally, "through antiquarian dealers and local historians. Nothing as dramatic as Mr. Vance's activities, naturally." But her confession was interrupted by the appearance of Miss Holloway, who approached our corner of the library with obvious reluctance. The poor woman's distress had not diminished overnight, and she carried herself with the defeated air of someone overwhelmed by circumstances. "Forgive the intrusion," Miss Holloway said quietly, "but Captain Dubois suggested I should provide you with any correspondence that might bear upon Mr. Vance's recent activities." She produced from her handbag a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon. "These arrived for Mr. Vance during our stay in Naples," she explained. "He was most secretive about them, which was unusual. Normally, he shared all aspects of his research with tedious enthusiasm." Poirot accepted the letters with interest. He did not perhaps observe the return addresses or the identities of the correspondents. Miss Holloway's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm afraid professional curiosity got the better of discretion," she admitted. "At least one letter bore the letterhead of a London antiquarian firm, Blackwood and Associates. Another appeared to come from someone in Switzerland, though the handwriting was difficult to decipher." "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, examining the envelopes. "And Monsieur Vance's reaction to these communications?" "Increasingly excited and secretive," Miss Holloway replied. "He spent hours composing replies and seemed particularly anxious about maintaining confidentiality. He even asked me to post his responses from different locations around Naples, which struck me as rather odd." At this point, Professor Jones materialized at our table with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to libraries. He carried his leather portfolio and wore an expression of scholarly concern that seemed somehow calculated rather than natural. "I trust I'm not intruding," Professor Jones said, adjusting his spectacles in that characteristic gesture. "I couldn't help but notice the collection of Mr. Vance's research materials. As a fellow scholar, I wondered if there might be items of legitimate historical interest among his acquisitions." Poirot regarded the professor with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. You have expertise, perhaps, in the authentication of such artifacts. To some extent, Professor Jones replied smoothly, certainly enough to distinguish between genuine historical items and the sort of romantic fabrications that often deceive amateur enthusiasts. He reached toward the wooden bird, then hesitated. "May I?" "But of course," Poirot replied, though I noticed he observed the professor's handling of the carving with sharp attention. Professor Jones examined the bird with movements that seemed almost too practiced to knowing. His fingers traced the same patterns that had caught Poirot's attention, and I detected a subtle change in his expression, a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition rather than scholarly curiosity. "Interesting craftsmanship," the professor commented, his voice carefully neutral, though I would hesitate to assign it any great antiquity without proper analysis. Such carvings have been produced in the region for generations. The techniques change very little over time. "Yet, surely," Poirot said mildly, "a scholar of your expertise could detect certain indicators of age or authenticity." Professor Jones's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. Without laboratory analysis, any assessment would be purely speculative. The patination could be artificially induced, the wear patterns deliberately created. Amateur collectors are notoriously susceptible to sophisticated forgeries. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library's Persian carpets, I found myself increasingly aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath our civilized conversations. Lady Finch's financial desperation, Miss Holloway's revelations about secret correspondence, Professor Jones's oddly rehearsed responses to questions about his expertise. Each element added layers of complexity to what had initially appeared a straightforward case of death by natural causes. Most intriguing of all was Poirot's growing fascination with the wooden bird, which he continued to examine with the methodical attention of a man reading a particularly challenging text. Whatever secrets the little carving held, I sensed they might prove far more significant than poor Vance had ever imagined. Chapter V. False Channels and Dangerous Waters. Chapter 5. False Channels and Dangerous Waters. The third day aboard the Stella. Maris dawned with a curious tension that seemed to permeate the very air of the ship. Whether this atmosphere stemmed from the continuing investigation into Mr. Vance's death, or from some more subtle shift in the relationships between our fellow passengers, I could not say. What I could observe was that everyone seemed to be watching, everyone else with a wariness that had been absent during our first pleasant evening at sea. I discovered the first concrete evidence of this suspicious behavior quite by accident while taking my customary morning constitutional around the promenade deck. As I passed the wireless room, I glimpsed through the open doorway a familiar figure bent over the telegraph apparatus in earnest conversation with the operator. Lady Finch appeared to be dictating a message of considerable length and apparent urgency. Her usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, and she glanced repeatedly over her shoulder, as though concerned about observation. When she noticed my presence in the doorway, her reaction was immediate and telling. "Captain Hastings," she exclaimed, her hand moving instinctively to cover the telegraph form. "How pleasant to encounter you this morning. I was just sending word to my solicitor about some rather tedious estate matters." "Of course, Lady Finch," I replied politely, though I could not help noticing that she made no move to continue her transmission while I remained within earshot. "I trust there are no urgent complications requiring your attention." "Nothing that cannot wait until we reach Alexandria," she said with forced lightness, but her fingers drummed nervously against the counter as she spoke. I related this curious encounter to Poirot, whom I found in deep contemplation over Vance's effects in the library. My friend's reaction was characteristically thoughtful. "Most interesting, mon ami," he murmured, not looking up from the wooden bird carving he was examining through his magnifying glass. "And the lady, she seemed anxious that her communications should remain private." "Extraordinarily so," I confirmed. Her manner suggested something rather more pressing than routine legal correspondence. Poirot set down his magnifying glass with a small sound of satisfaction. "The plot, as they say, it thickens. But tell me, Hastings, what do you make of this?" He indicated a section of Vance's cabin inventory that Captain Dubois had provided. Among the scattered papers and overturned furniture, the ship's officers had noted several items that seemed oddly out of place: books that had been removed from shelves but left closed, drawers that appeared to have been searched but hastily reorganized, and most peculiarly, a lamp that had been moved from its original position but carefully replaced. It suggests, I said slowly, that someone conducted a very methodical search of the cabin before the body was discovered. Precisement, Poirot exclaimed. But observe the curious nature of this search, mon ami. It was conducted by someone who wished to examine Monsieur Vance's possessions but also desired to conceal the fact of having done so. This is not the work of a common thief. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Holloway, who approached our table with an expression of considerable distress. She carried a small leather portfolio, which she placed before Poirot with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Poirot," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I fear I have not been entirely honest about Mr. Vance's recent correspondence. There were other letters that disturbed him greatly." Poirot's manner became immediately attentive. "Letters of what nature, mademoiselle?" Miss Holloway opened the portfolio with trembling fingers and withdrew several sheets of paper. "Threatening letters," she admitted. "They began arriving about 2 weeks ago, sent to various hotels where we had been staying. Someone was clearly following our movements and warning Mr. Vance to abandon his research." I leaned forward to examine the documents she produced. The letters were typewritten on plain paper with no identifying marks, but their content was unmistakably menacing. Phrases like, "Cease your investigations immediately," and "Some secrets are better left buried," leaped from the pages in stark, threatening language. "Why did you not mention these before?" Poirot asked gently. "Mr. Vance forbade me to speak of them," Miss Holloway replied, her voice growing steadier as she made her confession. "He insisted they were the work of rival treasure hunters attempting to frighten him away from his discovery. But I could see how they affected him. He became increasingly paranoid and secretive. And the postmarks on these letters," Miss Holloway shook her head, "they varied: Rome, Naples, even one from London. Whoever sent them was either traveling extensively or had associates in multiple cities." As we absorbed this troubling information, I noticed through the library's windows that Professor Jones was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with 2 gentlemen I did not recognize. They were clearly second-class passengers, judging by their attire and the section of deck they occupied. Yet the professor's manner suggested this was no casual shipboard acquaintance. "Poirot," I said, directing his attention to the scene, "observe Professor Jones. Rather curious company for an Oxford academic, wouldn't you say?" Poirot followed my gaze and watched as the professor concluded his conversation with a series of sharp nods and handshakes. The 2 strangers melted away into the crowd of passengers with the practiced ease of men accustomed to avoiding notice. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. "It would seem that our scholarly professor has interests beyond Byzantine architecture." The remainder of the afternoon brought additional complications that served only to deepen the mystery surrounding Vance's death. Captain Dubois reported that the ship's stewards had noticed several passengers moving about the corridors during the crucial night hours, movements that could not be accounted for by normal shipboard activities. More disturbing still was the discovery that someone had attempted to access the ship's safe, where Vance's more valuable research materials had been stored for security. The attempt had been unsuccessful, but the scratches around the lock mechanism suggested considerable expertise with such devices. As evening approached and the Stella Maris continued her steady progress across the darkening Mediterranean, I found myself increasingly bewildered by the multiplying complications. Lady Finch's secretive telegrams, the evidence of a pre-discovery search of Vance's cabin, Professor Jones's mysterious associates, Miss Holloway's revelations about threatening letters. Each new development seemed to point in a different direction. Yet Poirot appeared oddly satisfied by these very complications that so confused me. He spent the evening hours in his cabin, surrounded by timeline charts and cabin layouts, muttering occasionally in French, as he worked through some complex calculation known only to himself. When I attempted to discuss the various leads we might pursue, he raised one perfectly manicured hand to forestall my suggestions. Nan, Hastings," he said firmly. "The obvious trails, they are precisely what we must not follow. In a case such as this, where so many clues present themselves so conveniently, one must ask why these particular breadcrumbs have been scattered for us to find." The ship's engines continued their steady thrumming beneath our feet as we sailed deeper into waters that seemed to grow more treacherous with each passing hour. Despite the deceptively calm surface of the Mediterranean night. Chapter 6. The Cipher of the Wooden Bird. Chapter 6. The cipher of the wooden bird. The fourth morning aboard the Stella Maris found Poirot in a state of intense concentration that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to one of his remarkable deductive breakthroughs. He had spent the previous evening in his cabin with the wooden bird carving, a powerful magnifying glass, and what appeared to be half the ship's library spread across his writing desk. When I knocked upon his door at our customary breakfast hour, I discovered him still in his dressing gown, surrounded by sheets of paper covered with his precise handwriting, and curious diagrams that resembled nothing so much as architectural blueprints. "Ah, mon ami," he exclaimed, without looking up from his work, "you arrive at the perfect moment. Come observe this most fascinating discovery." I approached his desk with the caution of a man who had learned that Poirot's enthusiasms often led to complex revelations that challenged everything one had previously believed about a case. The wooden bird sat in the center of his workspace, but now it was accompanied by detailed sketches showing its surface from every conceivable angle. "What exactly have you discovered?" I asked, settling into the cabin's second chair. Green eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle successfully solved. "This little bird, Hastings, it is not what any of us believed it to be. Observe these markings upon its surface, which we all assumed to be merely decorative." He indicated his sketches, where he had carefully reproduced every line and groove. On the carving's surface, what had appeared to be random decorative patterns now showed, under his methodical analysis, a distinctly purposeful arrangement. "Notice how these lines intersect at specific points," Poirot continued, tracing the patterns with his finger. "And see here these small indentations that appear to be natural imperfections in the wood. They are nothing of the sort. They follow a mathematical progression that could not possibly be accidental." I studied his diagrams with growing amazement. "You mean to suggest this is some sort of code precise?" Poirot exclaimed. "But not merely a code, mon ami, a cipher device. The bird itself functions as a key for decoding other information. One would need both his carving and the coded message to unlock the secret it protects." The implications of this discovery struck me immediately. Then Vance's treasure hunt was perhaps not the romantic fantasy we all believed. "Indeed," Poirot finished, "if this wooden bird is indeed a cipher key, then Monsieur Vance may have stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple gemstone." Our conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the cabin door. Captain Dubois entered at Poirot's invitation, his weathered face grave with concern. "Mr. Poirot," the captain said without preamble, "we have a problem. Someone attempted to break into the ship's safe during the night." Poirot's reaction was immediate and intense. "The safe containing Monsieur Vance's effects?" "Exactly," Captain Dubois confirmed. "The night watch discovered scratches around the lock mechanism and signs that someone had attempted to force the combination. Nothing was taken, but only because our security measures proved adequate to the challenge." I felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the Mediterranean morning. "Someone is desperate to obtain Vance's research materials. Or perhaps," Poirot said quietly, his gaze fixed upon the wooden bird, "someone has realized the true significance of this particular item, and wishes to prevent us from discovering what they themselves already know." Captain Dubois examined the cipher device with professional interest. "You believe this carving is connected to the attempted break-in?" "I am certain of it," Poirot replied. "But we must ask ourselves why now? What has changed to make immediate action necessary?" The answer came to me with sudden clarity. "Alexandria. We're approaching the end of the voyage. If someone wants to act, their opportunities are becoming limited." "Exactement, Hastings." Poirot's approval was evident. "The pressure of time, it forces the hand of our mysterious adversary. But this gives us an advantage. Nest CPA. Desperate actions often reveal more than careful planning." Captain Dubois assumed his most authoritative manner. "I'll double the guard on the safe and station, additional security in the first-class corridors. But Mr. Poirot, you're correct about this cipher device. Shouldn't we attempt to decode whatever message it's meant to unlock?" Poirot carefully lifted the wooden bird, turning it to catch the morning light streaming through the porthole. "That, mon capitaine, assumes we possess the coded message itself. Monsieur Vance may have found the key, but did he discover what it was meant to unlock?" This question occupied our thoughts as we made our way to the dining salon for a late breakfast. The ship's atmosphere had grown noticeably tenser overnight, and I observed our fellow passengers with new attention. Lady Finch appeared pale and distracted, picking at her food while gazing frequently toward the windows, as though calculating. our remaining time at sea. Professor Jones maintained his scholarly composure, but I detected a nervous energy in his movements that had not been present on previous mornings. Most telling of all was Miss Holloway's behavior. The poor woman seemed on the verge of collapse, her hands trembling as she attempted to manage her morning correspondence. When Poirot approached her table with polite inquiries about her welfare, her reaction was startling. "Mr. Poirot," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm beginning to fear that Mr. Vance's death may not have been the natural tragedy we all assumed." Poirot's expression became immediately grave. "What causes you to think so, mademoiselle?" Miss Holloway glanced around the dining salon with obvious anxiety before responding. "Someone searched through my cabin last night while I was at dinner. Nothing was taken, but my papers had been disturbed, my correspondence examined. Whoever did this was looking for something specific. And did they find what they sought?" "I don't believe so," Miss Holloway replied, "but only because I'd already given you the threatening letters Mr. Vance received. I fear there may be other documents, other secrets that I know nothing about." As the morning progressed and the ship continued its steady approach toward Alexandria, I found myself increasingly aware of the charged atmosphere that seemed to envelop our small community of passengers. The attempted safe break-in, the search of Miss Holloway's cabin, and Poirot's startling discovery about the cipher device had transformed what had initially appeared to be a tragic but straightforward death into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Most unsettling of all was the growing certainty that someone among our seemingly civilized company possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary to commit murder for whatever secrets the wooden bird might unlock. As the Egyptian coast grew visible on the horizon, I realized that our time for uncovering the truth was growing, as limited as our mysterious adversaries' opportunities for further mischief. Chapter 7. Dangerous Revelations. Chapter 7. Dangerous Revelations. The afternoon of our 5th day aboard the Stella Maris brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained tension that seemed to affect every corner of the ship. The Egyptian coastline had grown steadily more distinct throughout the morning, and the knowledge that our voyage would soon conclude appeared to have triggered a sense of urgency among our fellow passengers that manifested itself in nervous glances, hushed conversations, and a general restlessness that even the ship's experienced crew had begun to notice. Poirot had spent the morning hours in intensive examination of Vance's remaining papers, cross-referencing the wooden bird's cipher patterns with various documents from the dead man's collection. His concentration was so complete that he barely acknowledged my presence when I joined him in the library, where he had spread his materials across 3 separate tables. "Mon ami," he said, without looking up from his work, "I begin to suspect that poor Monsieur Vance stumbled upon something far more dangerous than any treasure of precious stones." "What do you mean?" I asked, settling into a nearby chair. Poirot indicated a series of documents arranged in chronological order. "Observe these letters and maps, Hastings. They appear to trace a historical mystery spanning several decades, but not the romantic tale of hidden gems that Monsieur Vance believed himself to be pursuing." Before he could elaborate further, our conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Miss Holloway, who burst into the library in a state of extreme agitation. Her face was flushed with exertion, and she clutched her handbag as though it contained her very life. "Mr. Poirot," she gasped, "you must help me. Someone just tried to push me over the ship's railing." The effect of this announcement was immediate and electrifying. Poirot sprang to his feet with an agility that belied his normally precise movements, while I felt my blood run cold at the implications of her words. "Mademoiselle, you are certain of this?" Poirot demanded, his green eyes sharp with concern. "Absolutely certain," Miss Holloway replied, her voice trembling. "I was walking along the promenade deck near the stern when someone approached from behind. They didn't speak, but suddenly I felt hands upon my back, pushing me toward the railing. If another passenger hadn't appeared at that moment—" "You saw who attacked you," I interjected. Miss Holloway shook her head in frustration. "The person was wearing a heavy coat with the collar turned up and moved away too quickly when the other passenger arrived. But Mr. Poirot, I'm convinced this is connected to Mr. Vance's death. Someone believes I know more about his research than I actually do." Poirot's expression had grown increasingly grave during her recital. "You must remain in public areas from this moment forward," he instructed firmly, "and Captain Hastings will escort you whenever you move about the ship. We are dealing with someone who has moved beyond theft to attempted murder." As we discussed security arrangements for Miss Holloway's protection, I noticed through the library windows that Professor Jones was once again engaged in conversation with the same mysterious second-class passengers I had observed previously. This time, however, their discussion appeared more heated, with sharp gestures and expressions of obvious disagreement. "Poirot," I said quietly, directing his attention to the scene, "our scholarly friend seems to be having difficulties with his associates." Poirot followed my gaze and observed the heated exchange with characteristic intensity. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "I suspect that recent developments have disrupted certain carefully laid plans." It was then that a steward approached our table with obvious nervousness, carrying a sealed envelope addressed to Poirot. "Begging your pardon, sir," the young man said, "but this was left at the purser's office with instructions for immediate delivery." Poirot accepted the envelope with interest and carefully examined it before breaking the seal. As he read the contents, I observed a subtle but unmistakable change in his demeanor, a tightening around his eyes that suggested both anger and determination. "What is it?" I asked. "A warning," Poirot replied grimly, handing me the single sheet of paper. "Mon ami, it appears we have made someone extremely nervous." The message was brief and typed on the same plain paper as the threatening letters. Miss Holloway had revealed, "Your investigation must cease immediately. Some secrets are worth killing to protect. Consider this your final warning." Miss Holloway read the note over my shoulder and went pale. "It's the same person who threatened Mr. Vance," she whispered. Poirot agreed, but observed the change in tone. "Mademoiselle, this is no longer about preventing the discovery of a treasure. This concerns secrets that someone considers dangerous enough to justify murder." As the afternoon progressed, additional disturbing incidents confirmed that we were indeed dealing with a desperate adversary. Captain Dubois reported that someone had attempted to access the ship's telegraph equipment during the previous night, apparently seeking to send unauthorized communications. More ominously, a thorough search of the ship had revealed that several items from Vance's original collection were missing, not the obvious valuables, but specific documents that appeared to have been selected with expert knowledge. The most alarming development came when I returned to my own cabin to change for dinner. As I opened the door, I was struck immediately by the unmistakable sense that someone had been inside during my absence. Nothing appeared to have been taken, but subtle signs suggested a thorough and professional search. Books replaced in slightly different positions, clothing rearranged with almost imperceptible precision. More unsettling still was the discovery of a small glass vial hidden behind the washstand, containing a clear liquid that possessed no discernible odor but somehow suggested extreme danger. When I brought this find to Poirot's attention, his reaction was immediate and alarming. "Mon Dieu," he exclaimed, handling the vial with infinite care. "Hastings, you have had a most fortunate escape. This substance, I have encountered it before in cases involving the most sophisticated of criminals." "What is it?" "A poison, mon ami, rare, expensive, and virtually undetectable by conventional means. It would appear that someone intended to eliminate you as a potential witness to their activities." The full implications of this discovery struck me with chilling force. Someone aboard the Stella Maris possessed not only the knowledge and equipment necessary for sophisticated murder, but also the connections required to obtain exotic poisons and the desperation to use them against anyone who threatened their secrets. As evening approached and the lights of Alexandria grew visible on the distant horizon, the ship had become a floating powder keg of tension and hidden menace. Passengers moved about with obvious unease. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and even the normally cheerful crew members went about their duties with watchful expressions. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that we were running out of time. Within hours, the Stella Maris would dock in Alexandria, and our closed circle of suspects would disperse to the four winds. If Poirot was to solve the mystery of Silas K. Vance's death and prevent further violence, he would need to act with decisive speed. The Mediterranean night closed around us like a dark curtain as the ship's engines drove us inexorably toward a confrontation that I sensed would prove far more dangerous than any of us had initially imagined. Chapter 8. The Truth Unveiled. Chapter 8. The Truth Unveiled. The grand salon of the Stella Maris had never seemed more elegant than on that final evening as our ship approached the harbor lights of Alexandria. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light across the assembled passengers, while the gentle rhythm of the engines provided a subtle counterpoint to the tension that filled the ornate room. Captain Dubois had, at Poirot's request, gathered all the principal figures in our mysterious drama for what my friend had termed a final clarification of certain facts. Lady Finch sat with characteristic dignity in one of the salon's velvet armchairs, her silver hair catching the light as she maintained her composure, despite the obvious strain of recent events. Miss Holloway occupied a nearby settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her face bearing the pale exhaustion of someone who had endured more than her share of shocks. Professor Jones had positioned himself near the salon's magnificent windows, where the approaching Egyptian coastline provided a dramatic backdrop to his scholarly silhouette. Captain Dubois himself presided over this gathering with the grave authority of a man who understood that serious matters were about to be addressed, his weathered hands resting on the back of a leather chair as he surveyed the assembled company with professional attention to detail. Poirot stood at the center of the salon, immaculate, as always, in his evening dress, his magnificent mustaches waxed to perfection, and his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a complex puzzle finally solved. Before him, on a small table, lay the wooden bird carving, several documents from Vance's collection, and what appeared to be a small glass laboratory slide. Mesdames et Messieurs, Poirot began with his characteristic theatrical flair. We are gathered tonight to discuss the death of Monsieur Silas K. Vance, which occurred in what appeared to be tragic but natural circumstances. I say appeared, because appearances, as we shall discover, can be most deceptive indeed. Lady Finch shifted slightly in her chair. Mr. Poirot, surely Dr. Reichenbach's examination confirmed that poor Mr. Vance died of apoplexy. His excitement over his treasure hunting clearly overwhelmed his weak heart. Ah, Madame Poirot replied with a gentle smile, but that is precisely what someone wished us to believe. The scene in Monsieur Vance's cabin was most carefully arranged to suggest exactly such a conclusion. Professor Jones adjusted his spectacles with that familiar nervous gesture. I'm not certain I follow your meaning, Mr. Poirot. The evidence seemed quite conclusive. Au contraire, Professor Jones, Poirot said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. The evidence was indeed conclusive, but not in the way you might expect. You see, I was struck immediately by certain inconsistencies in that chaotic cabin. Papers scattered everywhere, books pulled from shelves, drawers run, suggesting frantic searching by a man overcome with excitement. Yet certain details told a different story entirely. He moved to the table and lifted the wooden bird with characteristic precision. This little carving, for instance, which we found beside Monsieur Vance's hand, it appeared to be the final object of his attention, the culmination of his treasure-hunting obsession. But observe its position, more carefully placed, just so, as though deliberately positioned for our discovery. Miss Holloway leaned forward anxiously. What do you mean, Mr. Poirot? I mean, mademoiselle, that this cipher device, for that is what this carving truly represents, was placed beside the body by someone who understood its significance far better than poor Monsieur Vance ever did. Captain Dubois frowned with obvious concern. You're suggesting the cabin was staged after Mr. Vance's death? Besides, the killer made a crucial error while creating apparent chaos. They could not resist imposing a certain order upon the scene. Books were pulled from shelves but stacked neatly. Papers were scattered but remained in recognizable groupings. The very precision of the disorder betrayed the methodical mind behind it. Professor Jones had grown noticeably still during this explanation. These seem rather fanciful interpretations of what could easily be natural circumstances. Ah, mon ami, Poirot, said, or, should I say, Agent Jones. Poirot's words fell into the salon like stones into still water. For you are not, as you have claimed, a scholar of Byzantine history. Your knowledge of Mediterranean archaeology is entirely too practical, too specific, to focused upon matters that would concern an intelligence operative rather than an academic researcher. The transformation in Professor Jones was immediate and startling. The nervous scholar vanished, replaced by someone whose cold calculation was suddenly visible in every line of his bearing. Your accusations are absurd, Jones said, but his voice now carried a different quality entirely. Controlled, professional, dangerous. Are they indeed? Poirot continued implacably. Let us examine what Monsieur Vance actually discovered, and why it cost him his life. The Sapphire Scion of Sorrento was never a precious stone, Mies Amos. It was instead a coded diary, disguised as a family heirloom but containing explosive information about pre-war political dealings, information that could destroy careers and destabilize governments even today. Lady Finch gasped audibly. a diary. But surely, Madame, a document containing the true identities of double agents, the details of secret negotiations, the proof of betrayals that certain parties would kill to suppress. And Monsieur Vance, in his innocent enthusiasm for treasure hunting, had stumbled upon the key to unlocking these dangerous secrets. Poirot indicated the wooden bird with a gesture of elegant precision. This carving is a cipher device designed to decode the information hidden within seemingly innocent documents. Agent Jones here was dispatched to locate and destroy any trace of these old secrets before they could cause a diplomatic catastrophe. This is complete fantasy, Jones said, but his hand had moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket pocket. Is it? Poirot asked mildly. Then perhaps you can explain your possession of this. He lifted the glass slide from the table. A sample of the rare plant-based poison with which you murdered Monsieur Vance introduced into his preferred brand of chewing tobacco. It mimicked the symptoms of apoplexy perfectly while remaining undetectable by conventional examination. Captain Dubois had moved quietly to position himself between Jones and the salon's exit. The game is up, Professor. Mr. Poirot's analysis is supported by evidence we discovered in your cabin this afternoon. Jones's composure finally cracked entirely. You don't understand the implications, he said desperately. Those documents could destroy the balance of power in Europe. Vance was a fool who would have published everything for the sake of publicity. And so you killed him, Poirot said quietly, then arranged his cabin to suggest death by natural causes brought on by treasure-hunting excitement. But you could not resist the perfectionist's need to organize even apparent chaos, and that precision betrayed you. Miss Holloway stared at Jones with horror and comprehension. The threatening letters, the break-in attempt Saul to retrieve the cipher device, the device and any documents that might point to the true nature of the Scion, Poirot confirmed. But Monsieur Vance's death had already attracted too much attention, and Agent Jones found himself trapped aboard this ship with the very evidence he had killed to suppress. As Captain Dubois summoned his security officers and Jones was led away in restraints, the salon fell into a profound silence broken only by the distant sound of harbor bells announcing our arrival in Alexandria. The wooden bird remained on its table, an innocent-looking carving that had concealed secrets dangerous enough to justify murder, and had ultimately revealed the truth that destroyed its guardian's carefully constructed facade. The Stella Maris glided toward her berth as justice, like the dawn breaking over the ancient Egyptian coast, finally illuminated the shadows where murder had hidden itself behind the mask of natural death. Outro. Thank you so much for joining me aboard the Stella Maris tonight. Dear listeners, who would have thought that a simple wooden bird could unlock secrets dangerous enough to kill? That a respected professor was actually a deadly intelligence operative. I am curious to hear your thoughts. Did you suspect Professor Jones, or were you as surprised as Captain Hastings when the truth was revealed? Until our next mystery unfolds, this is Alie from Café Tales, wishing you pleasant dreams and safe travels.